You're listening to Earth Keepers, a podcast for all of us who believe that caring for the Earth is an essential responsibility of all human beings, and that our call to Earth keeping is ultimately foundational to every other vocation. In our honest conversations, you'll hear fresh perspectives and practical insights that help us to care for the planet and to love our places. Friends, I really liked putting this episode together for a number of reasons. First, our guest, Jim Stump, is an authentic guy and a deep thinker. Our conversation really stimulated some intriguing questions and insights that honestly continue to resonate with me. Also, though, I find it so freeing when people are willing to speak the truth about power that is actively working against the health of our world. As we all know, the current President, Donald Trump, is no friend to the planet, and his administration have set us back profoundly in terms of movement toward becoming a more ecologically just, less climate-destructive country. Among other things, there's been much pressure to expose more and more supposedly protected public lands to resource extraction. Recently, for example, there have been government-driven moves to open up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to the sale of oil leases. In response, a diverse group of faith leaders made a trip to that impacted region in Alaska to advocate for its protection from destructive oil and gas development, and to meet with indigenous community leaders to understand their perspectives on the matter. One of those delegates and our guest today was Jim Stump, Vice President of BioLogos. BioLogos is an organization that helps people explore and celebrate the relationship between faith and science. Jim is also a host of a really excellent podcast called Language of God, which explores the diversity of topics like religion and evolution, creation care, and climate change. Jim joins us on this podcast to speak up against the potential abuse of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, but also to share about the ways that he himself was deeply impacted by his encounters with the inhabitants of that remote wilderness, both human and more than human. Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. So, Jim, I'm really intrigued to have you with me on the podcast today. I know that you have some stories to tell from your recent journey to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, but before we go there, perhaps you could orient our listeners a little bit by telling us about yourself and the work that you do.
Well, thanks, Forrest. It's a privilege for me to be here with you and Earth Keepers and be able to share about some of this. I'm a philosopher by background and training, and came to the earth-keeping business, creation care business, a little later in life. So I was a philosophy professor and did philosophy of science, but was always pretty much engaged with physics and biology then. Started working for BioLogos in 2013, which then the main topics that we covered were creation and evolution. So that was where most of my background was, and my writing and thinking and experiences even. It was about 2019 that BioLogos made a very intentional decision to broaden the kind of topics that we cover, and climate change was first on that list of the topics that we think the intersection of science and Christianity has something relevant to say about. And so that was first on our list, and we thought that 2020 was going to be the year of creation care, and then COVID hit, and we pivoted pretty hard toward resources related to vaccines for a couple of years, and it's only been since about 2022, I guess, that we've been more deeply involved in climate change and creation care and trying to create resources related to that. So my own thinking has been fairly recent with regard to that, but have gotten pretty deeply engaged and involved in the topics since then.
Well, it's always fun when I get to interview another podcaster on the show. Could you tell us a bit more about your show? You're the host for BioLogos called Language of God, and I'm very sure that some of our Earth Keepers listeners will want to check it out if they haven't already. So give us a sense of what that podcast is about and who it's for.
Yeah, sure. And let me say that I'm more comfortable being on your side of the microphone than on this side. We're asking the questions rather than having to answer them.
I get that.
But yeah, thanks. So BioLogos started a podcast about that same time, 2019, called Language of God, that was named after the book of that same title that Francis Collins wrote. And it was one of the biggest requests that we had gotten from BioLogos audience to say, why don't you do a podcast? We're at about 225 episodes now. And a lot of them are me sitting down talking to somebody like we're doing right now about some topic at the intersection of science and faith. But increasingly, we've been doing series of what we call narrative episodes that often Colin and I go somewhere or we meet somebody or there's some other bigger topic that we interview a lot of people about and then come back and try to craft a narrative around that. It's been really fun. I don't know what your experience, Forrest, has been like doing this, but I often say that doing this podcast has been the most fun I've had in my professional career. It's just been a joy to get to talk to so many different kinds of people and explore in this long-form audio medium that I don't think 15 years ago we would have predicted would have become such a mainstay of culture that it has today.
I agree with you that it's an amazing privilege to be able to do something like this. I mean, you've got this excuse to talk to amazing and interesting
Right.
people all over the world, right? It's so like, what better job could there be?
Yep.
Yeah. Now you've got a Substack as well, which is going to figure in, I think, later in the podcast when we refer people to resources and images that they might want to check out from your trip. But maybe tell us about the Substack as well and mention where they might find that.
Sure, thanks. I've been writing at Substack for several years. Often it's about the trips that I go on, and so that's why this one's on there too. And it's just jimstump.substack.com. I have very porous boundaries between my work life and my personal life, and it all kind of blends together. And so my Substack is not an official BioLogos account by any means. I also write a fair bit for the BioLogos website at biologos.org. But yeah, my personal Substack is also about science and faith topics and the kinds of things that I've done, the places I've gotten to go as part of this job and to see and experience. And then I write to try to process and understand my experience. And so that's a lot of what I use that for. And in particular for this trip that we'll be talking about, there's lots of pictures, lots of photos from the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So that's a good place to see those.
Well, we'll definitely put links to those things in the show notes. But let me ask you something else. You know, whenever I'm getting to know new friends on the podcast, I'm always intrigued to know more about their relationship to creation, since that, of course, has so much to do with the work that we do in the world and the values that drive it, really. So I would be honored to hear you speak a bit about your relationship to nature and even how that relationship has been shaped and formed over the course of your life.
Yeah, thanks. I grew up in rural Midwest United States. So Michigan and Indiana is where I'm from, and small towns. And I mean like small towns, 2,000 people or less in these towns. When I grew up in Michigan, we had 7 acres and we're kind of hobby farmers. My parents were both public school educators, and that gave them summers off too. So we did a lot of camping, a lot of hiking, a lot of time spent in nature, which I think even growing up, I wouldn't have known how to distinguish between spending time in nature versus just what I did. I mean, I'd go out as a kid and just walk through the woods in our backyard. We had on that 7-acre piece of land, about 1 acre of it was a pond that I spent an awful lot of time swimming and fishing and ice skating in the wintertime. And just being outside was a big part of my life. As an adult, so grad school years, we lived out on the North Shore of Boston and started having kids. And my wife and I decided we need to be a camping family. I had heard some data somewhere that families who camp together, it's one of the most reliable trackers of families that are close later in life. And so we were just like, we're going to do this too. And it was so hard. And kids were eating bugs and, getting poison ivy, and we weren't sleeping, and we'd be driving home and start thinking, how can we do this differently next time? And, it was just something that got into us. Then as the kids were older, we spent a lot of time camping at music festivals, and just being in the outdoors has always been a really important element of my experience. I feel at home in the outdoors in ways that I don't always feel at home in big cities. And there too, because I'm a philosopher, I always want to ask questions like, what exactly do we mean by nature and creation? Cities are not supernatural. They're also creations in some sense. But there's something different about the created world apart from what we have done to it, right? That has been an attractive thing to me. And so this trip that I was on, it was really remarkable to be so far separated from any other effects of human civilization and culture. And I find in those settings in particular, whether it's just being me by myself or with this small group, that there's something about being in settings like that that draw important things out of us, that we can see a little more clearly values that we have that maybe in the noise in the midst of human culture can be drowned out by other things.
So you've been on an adventure and one that was informed by some really important goals and values. Tell us in general, if you would, about your travels in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and about some of the main purposes behind that trip.
There is a group called the American Lands Project who has several different regions that they are actively working to try to conserve, to protect. And one of those is the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So typically they have been taking groups of politicians to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which I'll use the acronym everybody uses for ANWR, ANWR. Their motto is experiencing is believing. So their goal is to get people to just go and experience this pristine wilderness of almost 20 million acres on the northern coast of Alaska. It butts right up against the Arctic Ocean. But 20 million acres that has been preserved since 1980 as a refuge and has come under threat more recently. It's been a long-term battle in Congress about whether drilling rights should be authorized for part of this. But the American Lands Project has tried to take groups of people to just experience it in the hopes that their experience will proliferate out and influence other people. This time they said, we'd like to invite a group of faith leaders because they have seen that among Christians in the United States, there's a lower level of commitment to preserving creation and fighting against climate change than among the general population. And so they said, we need to make some inroads into faith communities. So let's take a group of faith leaders. I was part of a group of 5 faith leaders that got to travel to this place. There was one representative from the American Lands Project who went with us, and then we had a guide who took care of us the whole time we were there. ANWR does not have any facilities of any kind. There are no roads, there are no buildings, there's no electricity, there's no plumbing. And so they take you in and give you tents and sleeping bags and a guide to take care of you for the whole time. So we were there for 5 days and got to experience just a little slice of those 20 million acres, but it was a remarkable time.
Well, one of the stated goals of the trip was that folks would learn to advocate for the protection of the region from oil and gas development, which of course is a noble phrase, but I just wonder in practical terms, what did you come away with in terms of what that actually means? What does it mean to advocate for protection, maybe in particular with the work that you feel compelled to do now in response to that trip?
So 2 weeks before we left on this trip was one of the mandated lease sales for drilling rights in what's called the coastal plain. The best estimates are that there might be 10 billion barrels of oil underneath the coastal plain. So 2 weeks before we left, there was one of the mandated lease sales. So the big, beautiful bill of a year ago mandated a number of sales for drilling rights. And thankfully, none of the big oil companies bid on this. It's so remote. It would be an incredible undertaking to try to turn this into an oil field. But there were a couple of smaller, more regional companies that did bid. So 77,000 acres of that 1.5 million acre has been granted for these 2 companies to do initial exploration, which includes some seismic activities and then even some drilling to see what's there. So we were educated on all of these things. Before this trip, I wouldn't have been able to tell you even what ANWR was and what the main issues were. So for me, it was primarily a trip of learning and becoming aware and of paying attention. So the goal for this trip is to try to communicate that back to other audiences. So even among Christians who are pretty aware of environmental concerns, I think there's something to learn about this particular situation, where things stand, and what's at stake. So what we've been trying to do since then, and we have another big call coming up where there's going to be more practical call to action kinds of steps that are going to be detailed. So perhaps your audience can keep tuned to your show notes where you might make some links to those. But to say, what should we do next? What's an actual helpful, useful thing that we in the Christian community who are concerned about such things can do next? But the first step is becoming aware, paying attention. You can't care about something if you don't know anything about it. And so part of what we're trying to do is to make the pitch for why you should care about this place. And even if it's a place that most of us will never get to go to. I mean, I'm among this very privileged few who got to go and experience it firsthand, and I want just a fraction of the enthusiasm I got from being there to rub off so that people will just have in their minds, oh yeah, there is this place called ANWR, and that it is pristine wilderness, untouched by human culture and civilization, and maybe that's worth preserving.
Well, I'm imagining that some of our listeners are maybe feeling the way I felt when I first began to learn about your trip. And that was, yes, certainly an emerging concern and compassion. But at the same time, there was this part of me that almost began to feel a little despair, because the fact is that it's our own government that is throwing its weight behind the exploitation of the wildlife refuge. What do you do when you're part of a country that is doing that sort of thing? And maybe that's just too broad a question to ask, but what do you do with those feelings, right? How do you work with them? And maybe even how do you stop them from making you want to give up entirely?
Yeah, so one of the elements of this that I've come back to repeatedly since I've gotten engaged in these topics over the last 3 years is that cultivating a sense of hope is different than being optimistic, right? Optimism is just a feeling that comes or goes depending on the external circumstances. And those external circumstances right now in our country, as it relates to care for the environment, are not good. And so I am not optimistic myself of the near-term future of what's happening related to climate and the environment. But hope is something a little different, and I liken it even to my faith, where I don't want to reduce faith to just believing something. Belief comes and goes, and one of my favorite stories from the Gospels is the man who came to Jesus asking for him to heal his child, and Jesus says, anything's possible for one who believes. And the guy answers, I believe, help my unbelief. Belief is something that comes and goes. But faith, I think, is better understood as commitment to an overall way of life, commitment to a community, commitment to a people, to a person, being committed to doing the right thing. Here's another quote I come back to, and it comes ultimately from Mother Teresa, that we're not called to be effective, we're called to be faithful. And being committed to doing the faithful thing, I believe in the long run is the right thing and will be effective. Maybe not in my lifetime, but I think this is what we're still called to do, to be faithful witnesses and faithful bearers of God's image, however we understand that, as it relates to the created order that we are part of. And so hope is being committed to that and having some reasonable actions that we can do, that the results are not up to us then. If my hope is only based on the results, then I would be without hope too. But my hope is that doing the right thing ultimately is going to be effective. The good guys win in the end. That's the commitment that I have. And in the short term, there's going to be some suffering. And I think we're called to address that to the best of our abilities and to be faithful.
Well, in that sense, I think what you're talking about is hope as commitment to a story. We know the overarching story that God is unfolding for people and for the planet. And while we may not know all of the ins and outs and twists and turns of the story, we know that there is a story, that there is a plan, that there is a God who holds this all in his heart somehow. And I think that is enough to give people strength to trust that there is that story that's ongoing, and that our part of it is to simply be faithful and to do what we know to do in the moment that is right.
And I don't want to be naive about this either. And I've been toying with this idea lately, and maybe you and even some of your listeners can weigh in and think about it a little bit as regards our work as humans and what we're doing, and sometimes the feeling of futility in it, and also the larger currents of the American public right now that seem to be going against this work that we feel is so important. I can't help but wonder if that has an influence on this story, even in the ultimate sense, that the things that we do matter in this regard. And this commitment to the story is that God does something else in the end. It's not all up to us. And we understand Christ's resurrection as the greatest exemplar of that. But even Christ's resurrected body had scars on it, which were the effects of what was done to him during this life. So God raises him from the dead, transforms him into the resurrected body, and yet it still has scars. So I believe that there's a new creation coming, but it's not a new creation ex nihilo that God just says, well, we'll just start completely over. That's too much of the narrative that in some corners of conservative Christianity leads them to not value conservation work and creation care, because they just think, well, we're going to get a new one. No, it's a transformation of what is into what will be. In the same way that Jesus's body wasn't still in the tomb, it was transformed into something new, but the raw materials from which you transform were there, and there were still scars on it. So are the things we're doing to this created order right now going to result in scars in the world that is to come? And should that motivate us to take better care of it? Are we placing parameters on what this created order can be transformed into? That's a lot of speculative theology, but I think it's theology that's rooted in other stuff that we believe and are committed to, and we need to take seriously.
Well, let me ask you this, something that's coming to mind here in terms of our commitment to the story. I wonder if some core element that is missing in our ability to commit to or believe in the story is our misunderstanding of what our role is in the world. I mean, I would say very few Christ followers take seriously creation care as a core vocation. That we are essentially called to be caretakers of the world, that gives us amazingly big responsibility, but also probably just a potentially deep sense of purpose as well, right? That God has this for us, this call in our lives to love and care for creation. And that's how our part of the story unfolds, is simply staying true to that vocation. But I just wonder if people really truly embrace that element of faith practice.
Yeah, I've seen some data that Christians do overwhelmingly respond positively to saying we should take care of creation. I think there's another step that you're pointing at that hasn't been connected to that, which is, okay, how does that translate into specific things that I myself can be doing, that my family can be doing, that my community, my church community can be doing, that are effective means of doing that? So I'm optimistic that some of the raw materials are there, but those dots just need to be connected a little bit better for many of the people in the Christian tradition to see that calling, to see how it can concretely play out, how it ought to play out in their lives. And just understanding the sorts of things we're committed to in our modern lifestyles and knowing practical consequences of those and the effects that they have, and giving another vision of what's possible for living a good and fulfilled life that isn't just, going the route of extractive capitalism as the default of this, of course, of what we have to do. If there's oil under there, we need oil. So if there's oil under the coastal plain in Anwar, we need oil. So let's just go get it. There needs to be a better imagination of how life might be better, not just in a sense of we're going to live the lives of ascetic monks, but that this is actually a good life. It's better to not be so caught up in these practices that demand further and further extraction all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I might add that an element of going deeper would also be the extent to which we put primary value on that calling to be earth keepers, to be people who care for creation. I do think that even people who care often see it as an add-on, one more ministry that they can do, right? And you do it if you like gardening, if it's something that kind of fits with your goals and your gifts. But I don't think that's it, right? I mean, I think what we are maybe missing as a church as a whole is that primacy of the calling, that there is no person who follows Christ who is not called to care for creation as a fundamental element of their identity as Christ followers.
I think that's right, and it's probably wise to include that along with this data I quoted about Christians responding positively to saying we ought to care for creation. But your point is that, where does that fall in the priority list of any individual? They might have positive feelings toward it, but if it comes down to that or getting a new big gas-guzzling car, the rest of society tells me I really need to have. Do they make those connections? Do they see that, no, this really is an important part of what we should all be doing and that it has implications for every area of life?
Yeah, for sure. Well, you noted that one of the other primary goals of this trip was learning from indigenous people and their traditions. And you spent time with individuals from the Gwichin nation, the people who are indigenous to that particular region. And I'm curious if you could tell us, what were those interactions like? And were you personally changed or challenged by those interactions?
Yeah, certainly was challenged. On 2 different occasions, we got to meet with representatives of the Gwichin people. The first was our entire team met in Fairbanks, Alaska, and we had a dinner with some of the American Lands Project people, but then a couple of indigenous people were invited to that gathering to talk as well. And there, the conversation was pretty fascinating because this news about the oil lease sale that had just gone on was much fresher. And we talked a little bit about the complications of that, because part of the promise of our government and then of the state of Alaska to indigenous people has been profit sharing of any of the proceeds of oil. And so the 2 people who were there both spoke to that, both of them on the side of please don't wreck our land. This has been an important and even sacred part of their lives for many generations. But one of the women said, but I'll also tell you that I'm a shareholder in one of these companies and would stand to make a fair bit of money from this if it went through. And that there are people within the indigenous tribes who are saying, come on, let us have this money. We want to have modern lifestyles too. And there's a very similar conversation there to what I was exposed to in some of the COPs recently from developing nations who are saying, let us build these coal plants because we want electricity too. You guys that have had it for a century are the ones that are responsible for all the climate change. And now you're telling us we can't even benefit from modern lifestyle? So there's a concern there, back to the indigenous people in Alaska, that we have romanticized an indigenous way of living that for thousands of years has lived in harmony, and I'll use scare quotes there, in harmony with the land in ways that we do not in our contemporary world. But part of that harmony is there were much higher infant mortality rates in those indigenous communities. There's a much lower overall life expectancy because if part of your lifestyle means you got to go out and get caribou and grizzly bear, not everybody comes back from those. And so I want to be careful not to perpetuate this romantic ideal of we need to protect this area so these few thousand Gwichin people can continue their indigenous lifestyles, which depends heavily on the caribou. Now, at the same time, the second meeting we had was on the way out of Anwar. We stopped in what's called Arctic Village. This is an incorporated village in northern Alaska, right on the edge of the refuge. And there we got to meet with the chief and with several other people. They do depend on the caribou. So the caribou herd migrates into Anwar every year, and on this coastal plain that's being opened up for drilling is where the caribou give birth. And in the Gwichin religious mythology, this is the birthplace of life. This is a sacred place. And the chief that we talked to, who's, 35 years old, this young guy, that it's essentially like the mayor of the town. We asked him, what do you do when the caribou come through? And he's like, yeah, we need about 4 caribou each year for my family. That's the meat that we live on the rest of the year. But he said, but I also take care of my aunt and another person, so I really need to get 6 or 7 each year. That's their lifestyle. That's what they live and depend on. But at the same time, he says, but man, we need this new medical facility here in town, and we need a bridge that goes across this river, because right now you can't drive to this village. You can't drive to Arctic Village, Alaska. You fly in on the bush plane. And so there's this push, this desire to become a little more part of the modern world, but at the same time to recognize that there is an indigenous wisdom that is not just always pushing for more. It's looking to live in harmony with the resources, of not consuming more of the resources than nature can replenish before the next cycle, and things like that. So it's complicated. And for me personally, I came back with lots of questions and not feeling that I have clear answers to all of those questions.
Well, I think it was wise in the PR material around this trip that the purpose was stated as we want to learn from the indigenous people, right? Because this is a crazy difficult question. How do you reconcile the exploitation of natural resources, in particular petroleum? How do you reconcile that with this more traditional lifestyle that you were describing? And that's not ours to figure out. Right? It's theirs to figure out. They have to wrestle with it and figure out how to move forward into their future.
For sure. Yep. And for us to just, again, become aware that there are these questions that they're facing. I mean, the reality is that pushing forward would mean the elimination of a culture that for thousands of years has existed and has wisdom for all of us, and has a language that is a particular way of naming and seeing the world around them. And that to eliminate that would be a great tragedy for all of us. We, the human race, would be poorer to not have the Gwichin people among us.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your admonition about romanticizing. I think that we often do that. We only see the positive, only see the lessons that we can learn and perhaps even emulate. But the questions, the issues, the cultural conflicts are much more complicated in real life. So I like that you have given us that check to be realistic as we think about what indigenous people can teach us and what are they struggling with. Well, I know that nearly all listeners to this podcast would agree with your advocacy for the protection of the wildlife refuge and, of course, your desire to see the Gwichin people treated justly. But I wonder if you were to speak more generally to an audience of Christ followers who are maybe less familiar with this idea of God-given vocation to care for creation. I know that one of the things that you help people to do is think about this big question, why should I care? And maybe let me put that question to you. Why is it that you think Christ followers should care at all about things like the prospects for environmental destruction in Alaska or issues like that all over the world?
One of the things I've learned about communicating these topics to audiences is that you have to tap into the pre-existing values of your audience in order to convince them, in order to persuade them of something like this. And so when you ask, why should we care? Why should we preserve? Why should we conserve ANWR? My first question is, well, what do you care about? And I think there's a way to connect what you care about to this place. Very crassly, it could be that you care about money and profits. And in response to that, I would say this would be so ridiculously expensive and so time consuming to go to ANWR and to set up a big oil field there in order for the return on investment. I said earlier that by the most generous estimates, there's about 10 billion barrels of oil under the coastal plain. That's 1 year's worth of oil for the United States. And it would take us at least 10 years to set something up at scale in order to extract this. So for those who are only concerned about money and profits, I think there's a case to be made to say, leave this one alone. This isn't worth your time. This is not going to return on the investment. For somebody else who says, well, I care about the welfare of the animals. Okay, this herd of, it's called porcupine caribou because they come from the Porcupine River in Canada and migrate here to have their calves. Setting up a big oil field there would be catastrophic to the caribou. And even the testing that has been approved in 77,000 acres, some of this is seismic testing. What they do is they bring in these big machines and pound the ground and wait for the shock waves, and that tells them something about what's under the ground. Well, the problem is they can only do that during the winter time when there's sufficient snow cover. And that's where polar bears come off the Arctic Ocean to den and to have their cubs. So if you're concerned about the welfare of animals, there's a simple and easy case to be made about leaving this alone. One of the most intriguing value propositions, though, for why you should care that I've been working through and wrestling with and trying to understand and articulate is the value of us restraining ourselves from developing every square inch that we can. I've been thinking of this almost in terms of a Sabbath in space as opposed to what we normally think about as a Sabbath in time, where every 7 days you stop and refresh and restrain yourself from doing the things that you could have done on that day, but we think it makes us better and even more productive. Again, if your ultimate values are productivity, I think there's a case to be made for the Sabbath, even in stopping and pausing every 7 days from what we do. But this is a Sabbath in space as opposed to in time, where we take these 20 million acres of ANWR or the 1.5 million acres of the coastal plain within ANWR and restrain ourselves and say, we don't need to develop every square inch. There's something beautiful, there's something good to be said for that place gets to remain what it is apart from our intervention in it. I'm not making a pitch that all of the world should be that way. We need development, we need farms, we benefit from roads and lots of other things. So this isn't a claim to say humans need to stop being human in this 21st century cultural sense. But it is a pitch to say maybe we can stop at that. Maybe we can stop with this space and leave this space to be as it was created to be. One of the important considerations that comes right from Scripture in Genesis chapter 1 in this regard is that God called this created world good long before we figured out how to extract stuff from it. It's good in and of itself. It's not only good for what we can get out of it. And I think we should care about ANWR and this pristine wilderness, untouched wilderness, because it's good the way it is. It's good the way it is right now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautifully put. I think sometimes that unless you've experienced a place like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, it's easy to think about them in abstract terms. And of course, it's a little harder to care on a personal level about such places when we keep them at an objective distance from our hearts. I wonder, so that we might understand the beauty and significance of this place, could you share with us some of your impressions of the Arctic, moments when you were perhaps struck with the wonder of that place?
For sure. So I said our group met in Fairbanks, Alaska. From there, we took a 12-seater bush plane to this village called Arctic Village, which is a Gwichin village, and it has an airstrip. It's the last place that has an actual airstrip that you can land on. From there, we got into a much smaller plane called a Beaver that is a 4 or 5-seater airplane if you really cram people in. And we had to go in 2 groups because we couldn't all fit. And from Arctic Village, you fly over the Brooks Range or through the Brooks Range. Our altitude is not as high as some of the peaks, so you had to kind of weave in between the peaks. And this is a plane that has real big rubber tires on then that can land right on the tundra itself because there's not an airstrip. And there's a valley called Sunset Pass. You can go to Google Maps and find Sunset Pass in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And we landed there and started setting up camp. And it immediately struck me that this has got to be the furthest away from civilization, the furthest away from culture that I have been. And of course, we brought some culture with us. We had tents, we had sleeping bags, we had food that we cooked on a camp stove, but so far away from any other modern sorts of convenience. And we had this guide. His nickname is Country. I can't even remember what his real name was because everybody calls him Country. And he was our guide. He was our protector. He was our chef. He's the one that trained us how to use bear spray that we had to keep on us at all times. And he would lead us then on these hikes every day in this little pass in the mountains, in this valley. There's still snow on the sides, and so rushing streams of melting snow. The stream right next to where we were camping over the 5 days we were there was dwindling. The first day we're there, you couldn't walk across it. By the end, you could walk across on stones, not get your feet wet because the snow was all melting away. But it just felt like we are so far away from anything that humans have done to the planet. And it was a remarkable, remarkable feeling. I was very interested in seeing some of the wildlife in Anwar while we were there and had read an awful lot about it before we got there. And for the first 3 days, didn't see very much but the ground squirrels that would come and be curious about our camp. I was looking for caribou and I was looking for grizzly bears, and we didn't see any for those first 3 days. Day 4, I finally said I was going to go out and take a solo hike, and Country, our guide, pointed me in the direction of, here's a loop you can take. It takes you up a different pass we haven't been to. It'll give you a different view out over the coastal plain. And said, just be aware of where you are. Keep watching. Always know your surroundings. And so I did. And 2 hours in, I was up, and it's so beautiful. I even made a video. I've been making a series of videos for BioLogos, and made a video about how beautiful this place is and how I was a little disappointed that I hadn't seen any of the big mammals. And I finished that video and was putting my stuff away and looked across. I was up on one hillside and looked across a valley to another hillside and saw something moving over there. And I'd had a number of false positives before that shifting shadows or something made me think that that rock was really a bear or a caribou, and I kind of figured that's what it was again. But with my binoculars this time, I saw my grizzly bear who was walking up the side and just digging, and I sat for half an hour, and he was probably 500 meters away from me. I'm not even sure that he knew I was there. I've been telling the story that once he turned and looked at me and kind of nodded, but that could be my own imagination. but sat and watched this bear. And I've seen bears before. I've been to the zoo. I've even seen black bears in other areas. But something about being so far out into the home territory of these majestic animals and watching one, gets me a little choked up just talking about it. Just get to sit and watch this bear be a bear. He's just doing his thing. It was remarkable. I came back from that hike, and country was fairly close to camp, but sitting out in the field a little ways with some binoculars and waved me over. And he said, I saw something moving. I'm not sure what it was. It might have been a fox. We sat for about 5 more minutes looking in this area, and then we saw it, and it was a wolverine. And country said he's been coming to this spot for 20 years, and this is maybe the 3rd time he's seen a wolverine. So we sat for 10 minutes and watched this wolverine kind of jump around in these herky-jerky ways and digging in the Arctic tundra and the grass and watching a wolverine just get to be a wolverine. And then that night, so this all happened the same day, that night we're sitting at camp about 11 p.m., you have dinner about 10 because you're out doing stuff and it doesn't get dark. So about 11, we're sitting around camp talking, and country says, caribou, and stands up, and we see 4 caribou running on the other side of the stream from where our camp was. These 4 buck caribou are just running, and they see us, and they stop. They walk across the stream. They were curious, and they sat there and they grazed right around our campsite for about 15 minutes, and then they wandered away. So seeing that kind of stuff was just remarkable, to be in that place. This is home for them. We use this word refuge, but it's not like they're refugees. This is their home. And we're there as guests. And to get to observe that was a remarkable privilege.
It strikes me as particularly beautiful and powerful about all these examples you're talking about is that it's likely that you were the first people that these animals had seen.
Very likely.
I don't know why that just strikes me as just so incredible. Yeah, I love that very much. Well, where do we go from here, Jim? What do we do? What do we do when our hearts are stirred by desire for environmental justice? What do we do when deep compassion moves us to want to respond?
There's a little bit of a paradox here in that I come back and say this was such an incredible trip and such an incredible experience to get to see, and for me to say, and I don't want all of you to go see it. I don't want this place to be turned into Disney World or even ecotourism. I don't want it to become this destination site that they'd have to provide infrastructure for now and build roads and have a trading post. And it needs to stay the way it is. And the reality of that means very few people are going to see it. Those animals are not going to see many more people there. And I think that's the way it ought to be. So it's a little hypocritical for me to say it's such a great experience and please don't have it yourselves. If you do get a chance, the Arctic National Wildlife is a national designation and anybody is free to go to it. It's just that there aren't any services there, so it's a little tricky to do it. So if you are among the few people that have an opportunity to see this, or maybe a place like this, maybe that's the practical step. So becoming aware that there are spaces like this, there are other spaces near you that are kind of like this. There are spaces that are untouched by human culture and civilization. Go experience them a little bit. Learn what they need to be protected for the future so that they are not exploited, so that they're not destroyed and extracted in various ways. So I hope my being able to have this experience and then share about it at least provides a little bit of spark for other people to say, there are other places near me that I can experience something similar, that I can learn what the creatures are that call this place home. The way I learned about the porcupine caribou and the grizzly bears and the wolverines. There are native species, plants too, that call places near you home that need to be preserved that need to be conserved and taken care of.
Earth Keepers podcast is a production of Circlewood. Our executive producer is James Amidon, and our sound engineer is Dave Wolfers. Jesselyn Gentry is our communications manager, and our music was created by Forrest Reed and Levgen Potovsky. I am Forrest Dinsley, your podcast host, and I'm really grateful for the time you've spent listening to this episode. Help us expand our reach by following or subscribing to this podcast on your favorite listening platform. And be sure to go to earthkeepers.online to sign up for our podcast newsletter. If you know someone who would benefit from hearing this podcast conversation, it would be great if you could send them a link. In any case, I hope you'll join us again for our next episode of the Earth Keepers podcast.